Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Microphone's working? Yes, good. All right. Well, hello again, everyone. I'm Sandra Jeppesen, Lakehead University's Vice President of Research and Innovation. I'm delighted to welcome you to Research and Innovation Week as we continue. Today we have the privilege of hosting a special talk with one of our 2025 distinguished researchers, Dr. Sandra Jeppesen. A word about the award. The Distinguished Researcher Award is the highest honor conferred by Lakehead University for research and scholarly activity. It's a once-in-a-career recognition reserved for those who have sustained an extraordinary level of research excellence for over a decade. Dr. Jeppesen's career embodies the very spirit of this award. As a professor in media, film, and communications, she's redefined how we understand the complex layers of our social fabric. Dr. Jeppesen is the co-founder of the Media Action Research Group and the Research Center for Sustainable Communities, and former Lakehead University Research Chair in Transformative Media and former University Chair in Transformative Media and Social Movements. Her recent books include Transformative Media, Intersectional Technopolitics from Indie Media to Black Lives Matter. Another is The Capitol Riots, Digital Media, Disinformation and Democracy Under Attack. That's 2022. And she's a prolific researcher and continues to publish and prepare manuscripts. So we have two other books forthcoming, Queer Cartography, and a second one, The Political Economy of Alternative Media. She has won the International Association for Media and Communication Research's Urban Communication Award for her research on smart cities. And she currently researches on community approaches to smart cities, smart technologies, data justice, digital EDI, and counter-mapping. She's also secured over $1.5 million in research funding. Very impressive. Perhaps even more remarkable is her commitment to training the next generation of researchers, having mentored and trained over 100 highly qualified personnel. Equally impressive. Dr. Jeppesen's exemplary contributions to Lakehead University have proven her to be a true distinguished researcher. And we're fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from her today as she presents her talk entitled Counter-Mapping Borders in Crisis, Housing, Healthcare, and Migration. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sandra Jeppesen.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And it feels a bit echoey. Is that okay? I'm okay? Okay. So hi, I'm Sandra Jeppesen. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to start by thanking everyone who's done all the setup today. Rebecca, Philip, and Jacqueline, who are running things. We couldn't do things without you all. And today I'm going to present just a sliver of my research on how communities create data sets and create maps in really unique and interesting ways. And they do so in order to address various crises from housing and healthcare to migration. I want to start with the land acknowledgement. So Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges its campuses are located on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. Lakehead Thunder Bay, and I think we have some people online joining us from Thunder Bay, is located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. Lakehead Aurelia, where we are here today, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, who include the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Lakehead acknowledges the history that many nations hold in the areas around our campuses, and is committed to building relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples based on principles of mutual trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. And I know these land acknowledgements may seem formulaic, but it's also important to talk about where we are and situate our research and our knowledge in the spaces that we inhabit and move through, and also to think about those relations in a good way and to start off things with this. Okay. Let's get started. This work comes out of a small project that I led on the topic of countermapping COVID-19 from the margins, data visualizations from the grassroots. And we researched with groups on a global scale in Spain, Canada, India, and Brazil, as well as 3 sites I'll talk about today, the US, Venezuela, and France. But first I wanted to acknowledge this amazing team of researchers that I've worked with. And the first 4 on the list there are faculty, and the rest are those highly qualified personnel that were mentioned, graduate students, and who've done amazing work. I also wanted to share a little pre-promo about the book Queer Cartography that came out of this project, and I love this design. It was designed by one of the grad students on the project. And finally, I want to acknowledge that some of my students from Theories of Social Justice from my graduate course are here today, and I hope to engage them and all of you in a conversation ongoing. And this is typically our class time, so. Okay. We often think of maps as neutral. They're driven by data, they are objective, they're scientific, they represent reality on some level. But maps tell stories. Maps draw borders, and those borders shape the stories that are told by maps. When we look at a map, we see demarcation lines between countries, between states and provinces, between neighborhoods, between formal and informal settlements or communities. But these lines are not natural. They represent decisions that people have made, and those decisions are most often made by and benefit people with power. So to help us understand the way power is encoded in maps, we use this term cartocracy. Cartocracy means autocracy through cartography, or simply put, rule by maps. We use this term to describe how governments create maps in order to control territory, define ownership of land, and historically, colonial powers asserted their political authority over land by mapping the land. But we also understand that borders are enforced not only at those lines, at those edges of countries, but also internally to our spaces. In airports and train stations, where you may be asked to show your passport, but also, and perhaps less obviously, in hospitals, healthcare clinics, everyday workplaces, government offices, and schools. And we only need to think about the ICE operations in the US, which have been in the media a lot lately, where they're arresting people at work, children at schools, people at healthcare clinics, and detaining people in hardware stores and shopping malls to really understand how the border inserts itself into our communities. But maps are not only tools of domination. Communities also make maps. And when they do, they engage in what we call cartopolitics, the politics of mapping back from within communities. And countermapping is this practice. It's a community practice of creating their own maps by either creating their own data sets or reappropriating and reinterpreting institutional data sets that are publicly available to challenge official representations, misrepresentations, and so on, to assert their presence and even to reshape how spaces on maps can be differently understood based on their own lived experience of those spaces. They are quite literally putting themselves on the map. So today I'm going to focus on 3 case studies, and based on 3 crises in 3 different countermapping projects in 3 different countries. The housing crisis in California and the work being done by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. The healthcare crisis in Caracas, Venezuela, where Mapeo San Miguel has been mapping communities. And the migration crisis in Europe, specifically in France, mapped by Cali Migrant Solidarity. Across these 3 cases, I ask, what happens when communities make their own maps, especially during times of crisis? And of course, we want to know, why does that matter? So let's start with our neighbors to the south, the USA, and their housing crisis. The Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, or AMP, collects public records and community testimonies to build interactive maps of eviction patterns. And this is a zoomed-in still shot of one of their maps. They call their work data visualization. In other words, they take data and make it into pictures to visualize it, in this case maps, and they also speak of themselves as critical cartographers. In other words, they're doing cartography in a way that goes against the grain. In plain language, they turn eviction statistics into maps that people can see and understand. Between 2014 and 2016, more than 1.5 million people in California were targeted by eviction lawsuits. And this doesn't account for people who received eviction notices and moved out. This is people who went to court to fight it. So there are millions more that are not represented in this data, in this statistic. We also know that evictions are not evenly distributed. They disproportionately affect racialized communities, women-led households, low-income tenants, and migrants. So on these anti-eviction maps, certain counties have lighter or darker colors, and the darker shade represents a higher density of displacement. And when you hover over one of the counties, it brings up the statistical numbers that we see here. But if you were to just look at those numbers, they don't tell the story that the map tells by giving us the visual. So with these maps, the evictions and displacement become visible. Where are these people moving out of? Where are they moving to? And you can see the map pushing them in different directions. Why is that powerful? I argue that housing operates as a kind of internal border logic. A logic is a system of organizing society in terms of the ways that we think and act. So as you can see in these 2 images, international borders and residential fences have a similar aesthetic, which makes visible that they also share a similar logic. Eviction isn't just a legal process, though. It is a line drawn around and a border imposed upon who stays and who must leave. Landlords use legal tools available to them to evict people and in order to renovate the apartment in what's called renovictions, and they drastically raise the rent disproportionately to the amount they've spent on the renovations typically, and it pushes people out and displaces them. And what we see often are that wealthier, often white tenants move into and replace these long-standing multi-ethnic communities or multicultural neighborhoods. And part of the reason people move into these neighborhoods is because of the vibrancy created by these multi-ethnic communities. And at the same time, their presence there slowly pushes that out, that vibrancy out. But displacement and dispossession patterns really remain abstract and feel a bit underrepresented or harder to see, but with countermaps, they become visible and undeniable. Oh, there's a little space missing in that typo. During COVID-19, we saw something really interesting happen. Eviction moratoriums. Eviction moratoriums revealed something really crucial, that eviction is not natural. It's not the way things have to be. It's something we do. It's policy-driven. When governments paused evictions, mass displacement slowed and paused as well, which demonstrated that these housing borders are socially constructed and they can be enforced or not enforced. It's something that we as a society decide to do. So countermapping in this context does three things that are really important. It makes these structural injustices visible. It also provides a space to build solidarity by showing people they're not alone. People get together, they do this research, they make these maps, and they become a community through the process of community mapping. And three, it shifts the narrative from charity to social justice. So when we think of charity, we think of a hand out or a hand up, and that's a kind of humanitarian approach to helping people who are in vulnerable positions. But with social justice, rather than asking for temporary relief, AMP's work helps communities and supports communities to reimagine housing beyond landlord control. And so in times of crisis, in times of housing crisis specifically, countermaps expose the system and translate data into community power. Okay, let's head south, which I really wish I was doing today, and go to Venezuela. La Vega is a neighborhood, a community, sometimes called a barrio. I think barrio has a bit of a pejorative spin to it, so I use the word community, which is really the direct translation. It's a neighborhood community home to roughly 200,000 people. It's considered an informal settlement because for many years, large portions of it did not appear on official maps. Streets are missing, addresses just simply did not exist. Imagine calling an ambulance and your house is not on the map. How do they find you? This invisibility created a healthcare crisis. Emergency responders could not find residents, service providers could not coordinate care effectively. People in need of healthcare could not access it. So what they did in the community was to make a map, and the project called Mapeo San Miguel did this community mapping project where community members who live there and university students got together and used open source software called OpenStreetMap to walk the neighborhood and map it themselves. And you can see on this map, that map up there, the space where the yellow lines and pink dots are, that's La Vega. And it was unmapped before, and they walked that map and they walked the space, the urban space, and put 5 miles of streets on the map, as well as dozens of service points, which are clinics, shops, and gathering spaces. But here's what makes this case especially... I'm behind by one. Okay. Here's what makes this case especially powerful. La Vega serves as an autonomous space, an autonomous neighborhood. It has a long history of revolutionary and political resistance, of activism. It also has a long history of police incursion into the neighborhood with extrajudicial killings of people where they claim they're eradicating gangs in the neighborhood, but without any due legal course, due process, simply going in and killing people. So people in this community then didn't necessarily want to be 100% visible to the authorities. They took strategic decisions to map service access points, but not individual households. And the service access points are where the ambulance can find you, where you can meet up and get healthcare services and access other kinds of community resources. So this is what I call strategic invisibility, so sometimes visibility, sometimes invisibility. Countermapping is not always about being seen by the state. Sometimes it's about being visible to each other. How do we find each other in these spaces? And this is something the queer cartography book talks about a lot. Sometimes it's about remaining partially or entirely invisible to authorities. And in this case, in this particular map, the map functioned through visibility, through a public health tool, and a navigation system for residents and for service providers, and through invisibility, providing a protective shield for the community members in their homes. So during crisis, whether it's a pandemic or political unrest, or in this case, both at the same time, mapping becomes a way to assert existence. To say, we are here, we count, we can coordinate and organize ourselves. And importantly, this project was led from within the community, and that distinction matters. When outside organizations, such as humanitarian NGOs, map marginalized areas using drones typically, areas like informal settlements, refugee camps, and so on, about which more in a moment, that data, which is purportedly being collected to help serve the people living in these areas, can be repurposed by the state for surveillance and social control, putting the community members at risk of arrest and state violence. By contrast, community-led mapping, such as the Mapeo San Miguel project, centers the community and bases its actions on mutuality, consent, autonomy, and solidarity, mapping the community and sharing the data on the community's own terms. In times of healthcare crisis, then, this countermapping work can literally save lives. Okay, so from South America, let's turn our attention to Europe and specifically the border in northern France with the UK and maps of the migrant crisis, which is intensifying in Europe. So I'll talk a bit about Calais and the politics of crossing, which is a term that people use to talk about migrating across borders. For decades, migrants seeking to cross into the UK gathered near Calais, France, and formed an informal housing camp that became known as the Jungle. At its height, housing thousands of people. It was never regularized. It never became a refugee camp. It was never recognized by the state. It was as informal as it gets. It also became one of the most heavily policed sites in France, if not all of Europe, with fences, drones, helicopters, cameras, and troops on the ground. So in response, activists and migrants living in the jungle worked with and as part of the Calais Migrant Solidarity Group to create these solidarity-based countermaps. One was the transborder map that you see here, very vibrant map, which documents, and I know it's hard to see the details, but it documents detention centers, border guard patrol routes, border infrastructure, such as fences, but also gaps in fences, drones, helicopters, and so on. It also maps the location of solidarity networks where people can go to get support, access resources, find out maps, and get further information that will support their crossing. This map also includes a lot of photos of people who are actively engaged in Calais migrant solidarity. So putting people into the picture is something that we found was really strong in community mapping. And finally, it also includes some political commentary in French and English in the yellow boxes on the right with the title, "The Militarization of the External Borders of the European Union Wears On, Not If We Can Help It." So very politicized map. And it provides information to support migrants in their journey to and through Europe. They've also produced an interactive map of surveillance cameras, which is still active today. Users, anyone, can log on and add camera locations anonymously, and those locations are pins. These are then eventually verified by Calais Migrant Solidarity, but as soon as you pin it, it's there, and they will eventually get around to verifying them. The map categorizes, so it's very participatory in terms of anyone can participate in creating points on the map. And the map categorizes and color codes cameras as state-owned, which are red, privately owned, which are turquoise, and corporate, which are dark blue. Because for migrants, visibility can be deadly, it's really important to map cameras. Visibility can lead to arrest, deportation, and sometimes even death, and there have been thousands of deaths in this migrant crisis. Migrants navigating urban space need to know where they're being watched so that they can avoid cameras, so that they can traverse the city safely. Mapping surveillance, thus, makes the surveillance apparatus visible. Here again, we can see how visibility and invisibility can be strategic. Protest, so they do a lot of protests at the borders. We saw that in the pictures on the map. Protest requires mass visibility, where everyone as a group raises their voice and the numbers matter. And so, so you need to be visible, whereas crossing often requires individual invisibility. Another important aspect is that these countermaps did not ask the state for permission. They did not also simply claim refugee rights within existing systems. They supported what researchers call autonomous mobility, the idea that people move and can move and enact their autonomy through movement because they choose to survive, work, and live regardless of border restrictions. So in these various crises, countermaps become tools of survival. They reveal hidden infrastructures of social control and policing and militarized infrastructures. They share tactical knowledge among and within the community, and they also build out transnational solidarity. So many of these maps and mapping projects connect to other mapping projects, and people will learn from the maps online. They don't necessarily meet the other people, but they'll see, oh, they're doing this mapping project. We need that. We're going to do that here. So it kind of spreads like wildfire. And they transform borders from fixed lines on maps into contested terrain through rethinking our understanding of the meaning of maps and borders entirely. Across these multi-sectoral and multinational cases, we can see three different ways of thinking about borders. The first one, border logic, this is the one we all know. This is the one, if you've ever traveled anywhere outside of Canada, you have engaged in this. It's about rules by the state. It's a state-centered approach, and it emphasizes control: eviction, enforcement, deportation, border detention, privatized healthcare, limited access, and so on. And we think of this as just the way things are. It's very natural. This is just, of course, the way things are. This is what we are accustomed to, so we don't tend to question it. But there are other ways of thinking about borders, as you might have guessed from what I've already said. So the next way of thinking about it, I've also talked about a little bit, the idea of humanitarian rights-based logics. These logics say that some people are, so we all have access, we all have equal access to inalienable rights on a global scale. And so this argues that people deserve housing, that people deserve medical care, that we deserve to be able to apply for asylum within the existing legal frameworks. And we have the right to claim these human rights. And this kind of logic is advanced by humanitarian NGOs. And I'm in favor of human rights, despite what I'm saying here. This is not a critique that we have human rights. My critique is that those human rights are not accessible equally to all people. And so this is where no border logics come in. It argues, back to the humanitarian right. So humanitarian logics work within states. So for humanitarian NGOs to work within a particular country, they have to abide by the laws and the legal systems of that country, and they try to fill the gaps in rights. So if people have the right to food and housing, the humanitarian organization will support a refugee camp and provide food and housing. So they're filling gaps but this gap-filling mechanism of humanitarian aid actually reveals the problem of unequal access to human rights. If everyone had access to human rights, we wouldn't need humanitarian aid. But what no border logic does is it takes things one step further and says, yes, we do not have equal rights. We don't have access to the rights that we are supposed to be guaranteed. And so they ask instead, what happens if we reorganize space on our own autonomy, collective autonomy, around autonomy, mutual aid, and supporting each other in self-organized communities rather than asking for permission and being subjected to social control and these sort of borders that have an inside and an outside to them. So crises intensify borders, and maps can serve as resistance to this intensification. During pandemics, healthcare access narrows. During housing shortages, evictions accelerate. During economic collapse or war, migration routes become more dangerous. In crisis, official maps often fail marginalized communities. They erase them, put them under surveillance, criminalize them, attempt to control them, render them vulnerable to harms, and enact policies and practices that put lives at risk. Community countermapping projects have responded to these intensities by challenging cartocracy by making harm visible on maps, by sharing life-saving information, by asserting autonomy and strengthening collective identity in communities, through taking action directly, and by protecting communities and creating justice through strategic invisibility that imagines alternatives beyond state control. They are not perfect. They do not abolish inequalities or change structures or infrastructures. But they do shift the terrain by contesting and directly confronting them. And in doing so, they show that borders are not, whoa, that's my teaching voice, that borders are not natural facts, they are political choices. I guess I was too far away from the mic. And if borders are constructed, as I have been arguing, and as I have shown today, they can also be contested. We live in a moment of intensifying cartocracy or rule by maps, algorithmic policing, predictive analytics, AI border control, drones, and so on. But we also live in a moment of expanding cartopolitics where communities can access a wide range of open source digital tools to create their own participatory data sets and to engage in digital storytelling through getting together, talking about their lives, and making maps about, by, and for their communities. Thinking about what does our community need and how can we meet that need ourselves, and maybe mapping is part of that. When communities make their own maps, especially during crisis, they challenge narratives of displacement and dispossession, enacting their right to a home. They reject health marginalization by negotiating safety, security, and healthcare access. They refuse the dominant narratives of illegality and invisibility by enacting autonomous mobility. Countermapping, therefore, is about much more than geography. It is about creating a sense of belonging. It is about who counts. It's about who gets to stay, who gets care, who gets to move, and who gets to find a home. Thus, through countermapping and cartopolitics, they transform data and maps from mechanisms of domination or cartocracy into practices of everyday solidarity. Ultimately, countermapping invites us to imagine a world where housing is secure, healthcare is accessible, and movement is free for all. These community mapping projects challenge us to ask, how can maps reimagine land, space, and territories that delimit healthcare, migration, and housing rights in order to render visible and provide support for different, more egalitarian relations of community, care, and autonomy for all? There is a thank you slide. It doesn't want to come up, so you get, oh, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra, for an excellent overview of your studies, and what a framing of social justice, well, certain aspects of the social justice challenges that we have. I'm sure you've triggered a lot of interest, so we will have a few minutes for questions, and we'll start with anyone here in the room who might have a question. Yes?
It's warm up here.
I don't know if I need that. Three points you made. The last one, the ain't no borders high enough.
Right.
Another was that borders are political choices. And the third, that you transform borders into contested terrain. President Trump put up a map with the American flag over the U.S., Canada, and Greenland. And he's saying that Greenland is Denmark simply because somebody drew a line on the map. With your thinking on this, does he have a logical position that he can assert control of Greenland?
I love this question. Because, thank you, this is actually a really crucial point in thinking about borders. Because, am I supposed to be just going off map here? Oh, I need the mic?
Yeah,
Okay.
as long as you're talking.
As long as I talk into it. Hello? Yes. Okay. So, and I don't need to be, oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that we want to think about is the conflict or the tension between national autonomy, which Trump is walking all over in his discourse around different countries, including Canada, which everyone is up in arms and very alarmed about. And so we need to maintain borders in that sense so that we know who is governing a particular country and that the people who live there are protected by some of the laws of the land. But I think we also need to, directly opposite to that, challenge those laws and legal frameworks. So I'm not arguing that we should no longer know where we live or who we're electing and that kind of thing, but more that some of these laws don't serve very well. They serve people who already have power. And I think, obviously that's Donald Trump's position, right? So he wants to just tear down all borders and take over the whole world maybe, or starting with, the countries that you've named. So I think that there's a moment at which this national sovereignty becomes problematic when people become overly patriotic and than unwelcoming to immigrants, for example. So there are a lot of tensions around confronting these borders in particular ways. And I think that's what your question is about. And it's we need to maintain national autonomy, but we also need to maintain individual autonomy to move, to have housing, to have healthcare, and so on. And these two things are often in tension with each other, and that's where the crisis happens. Yeah. So thank you. Brilliant question.
First of all, thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I see a lot of alignment between this morning's presentation and yours. This morning's was about racism during these difficult times. And we know that there are attacks on social norms that are happening right now all around us. We know that there's shifting borders through political choices and decisions. And those are affecting the lives of people. Yeah, we can push back against them, and Minnesota is probably a great example of pushing back against that to state who you are and what you believe in. But we're also facing 3 more years of this particular administration, which tends to ignore laws. It certainly is trying to shape social norms, and is very confrontational. What advice are you giving, or would you give, to folks who are looking ahead to these next 3 years and are quite concerned about the way society is going and the normalization of this aberrant behavior that this fellow is demonstrating to us on a weekly basis?
What do we do about Trump? That's your question? Okay, well, I don't know if I can answer that. But I do, my research has been over many years about how communities push back. And I love your example of Minnesota, where communities did push back, and eventually ICE left Minnesota, but not without, loss of life. And so, but I do think that what's going on in people pushing back against ICE is really interesting. And, they go out in the street, they have these community networks, they go out in the street when they hear ICE in their neighborhoods, they blow whistles, they heckle them, they make it hard for them to do their job. And I think that that's a really good way of pushing back against the border guard in your community, making them feel very unwelcome and making them feel that their presence is not wanted. And yet, is it enough? I think that's really the question that you're asking, right? Trump is, he's thrown out the rule of law, and so it's very difficult to know where not us, the Americans, because we don't live there, thankfully, but because it's a very complicated situation right now for people living in the U.S. They don't know where they stand. The Supreme Court passes, laws saying that Trump's tariffs are illegal, and he's like, I don't care. I'm going to, tariffs for everyone, tariffs for everyone. So it's a very destabilized situation down there, and I think people do need to get out in the streets and push back against all this stuff and organize, from high to low, every sector of society. And so from the Supreme Court down to people blowing whistles in the street, it's all needed to just sort of keep things alive, really, until the next administration. And of course, everybody's hoping the midterms will bring some change. But so I don't have an answer for what to do about Trump, but I am in favor of organizing against injustice, and there's a lot of that going on, so.
Let us follow up with, do you have an example of any other democracy that has been forced into guerrilla warfare in order to retain its own sense of democracy against its own government?
Okay, guerrilla warfare has happened in many, many places.
Within a democracy, you're saying? And within a democracy, because what I see is guerrilla warfare tactics being used by normal citizens to assert their rights against a government that is trying to change what those rights are.
So India, I'm not an expert on this topic, but India, in the time of Mahatma Gandhi, so he's well known for having freed India from British rule. But there was also guerrilla warfare going on in the mountains, and that supported his peaceful marches and so on. So there's one, I don't have a deep knowledge on that, but it's one example where guerrilla tactics were used to, remove a colonial power in conjunction with many other types of tactics in different sectors of society. So I think if that's what it takes to keep your country a democracy, I don't know if anyone ever wants to be pushed to that. I have read some interesting analysis in the New York Times about what would happen if the US invaded Canada. And that's one of the things they talk about. Guerrilla tactics and guerrilla warfare would be very difficult for the US to take over Canada, but it would last 20 years. I'm like, really? That's your answer? But anyway, there's a lot of conversation about guerrilla tactics, for sure. And where, how far does that go? And nobody wants to see a civil war or a war between us and the US. Like, that is not, hopefully, coming. No. Okay, but back to mapping.
So there is a question online. The question is, digital visibility is important for health crises, such as ambulances locating people's homes. You used that in your La Vega case study in Venezuela. We know how much the Big Brother uses this surveillance as a weapon against marginalized communities. How can we ensure this does not happen?
That is a huge question. I'm just getting all the big questions. So this is one of the biggest questions facing our society today, I think, in terms of surveillance of marginalized groups. And one of the problems is that this surveillance is highly invisible. So you don't know that you're under surveillance, hence the need for security camera mapping or surveillance camera mapping. And so I think the way that it's playing out now is that marginalized groups are fighting back against, I'm answering as if you asked, Jacqueline, but marginalized groups are really fighting back against surveillance. But one of the challenges is that we aren't always aware when we're under surveillance. Our data is under surveillance, our click streams, surveillance is happening all around us all the time. And so part of that has to be education and people learning about when they're under surveillance and how to push back against it. But I don't think that's an adequate answer. I think that we need to regulate big tech on a broad international scale to stop doing this. And I think that so again, I'm a proponent of regulate, activate, and everything in between, but I do think that increasingly we're seeing all the harms caused by surveillance, caused by social media, platform surveillance, platform labor, people doing their Uber Eats deliveries and their Airbnb. I mean, you're under surveillance. I have a confession, I have one of those mop vacuum things, and it mapped my house. That is in the cloud somewhere. A map of where the bedroom is. Like, that is dangerous, honestly. And I'm really happy that my little robot mops my kitchen every night when I'm sleeping. And I give up my data for that. It's a privilege to be able to do that, but it's very dangerous to put people under surveillance in their everyday lives. We wear these watches, we're being followed. And in the old days, if you were being followed, there was a person and you could say, stop following me. Now we don't see that. It's just all the time. And so we need a lot of education about that, about how to avoid being put under surveillance when you're online, how to fight back against that, how to have digital security for yourself and your community. And there's lots of community workshops where people teach those types of skills, but I think teaching them to small groups of people who are interested, great starting point, but I think they should be mandatory for everyone in the whole society because we don't know what's going on, and I think that's really dangerous. I also have a colleague who studies surveillance and could probably have more to say about it than me, so sorry, Deborah, if I've oversimplified.
I'm very interested in how some of the research was conducted and in particular, how some of those maps that you presented, how were they prepared? Because notwithstanding the California scenario context, the other ones in Venezuela and France, these are marginalized, disenfranchised people. So how are they able to even gather their resources or their energy to produce something like that you showed? Who does that mapping?
That's a great question, and it's complicated. I think many of the people that we interviewed for our for this project, so we've for the maps that I showed today, we didn't actually interview anybody. I did interviews with Calais Migrant Solidarity, but not about their maps per se, about more their activist practices a few years ago. So I knew about the maps, I knew how they had been made and so on from those interviews. But the research that we did for this, or that I did for this project, was more, we were gathering different maps in different countries and trying to see what people were doing. I didn't interview for this this particular presentation. I didn't interview anybody, I just looked at their maps and did a bunch of research in the literature around what they were doing. So, and I'm in contact with them, so I emailed them to get permission to use their maps and so on. The Mapeo San Miguel, that project was initiated by a professor at a university in geography and his students. And they worked with the community, but it was really community-driven and community-led. But he did a lot of workshops with people on how to use OpenStreetMap. And it's a pretty simple app that they use, just, you know, you put the app on and then it just follows you around and makes a map. So I think that one of the things that became really clear in looking at these projects is that marginalized people know how to use digital technologies. They're marginalized in some ways, but they're very savvy with technologies. And people crossing borders are extremely savvy about how not to be under surveillance, how to get information online, how to communicate in ways that are very imperceptible to the state and so on. So there's a lot of tech savvy stuff going on. And then there's also a kind of support networks that form among activist groups that may have a little bit more resourcing, more time to spend on making maps and so on. And then they work with the communities, asking the communities, what do you need? How can we do this as a project? One group that we did interview in Brazil is Indigenous Emergency. So I didn't talk about them today. That's not really my piece of the research per se, but they found that during COVID, the state was not representing their deaths in their community. And moreover, it was public health coming into their community that brought COVID into the community and caused a lot of sickness and death. And so, and also a meat packing factory in the communities also was they weren't using proper protocols, and so a lot of people were getting sick there, Indigenous people. And none of it was being reported by the state. And so they just got together in their communities and said, we need to put ourselves on the map, we need to make maps that show what's going on. And they made all these overlaid maps that showed the spread. And they just got together as a community and taught themselves how to do that. They generated their own data sets, they counted themselves, and then they used those data sets to make maps. So there's a lot of self-teaching, a lot of
self-organization.
Self-organizing,
Wow.
exactly, yeah.
If I may, just an observation on the California one, you said 1.5 million eviction notices in California. So that would be like one person in 20? Or unless we're double counting or it's over a period of time, like what does that 1.5 million eviction notice
over a period of 2 years, I guess some people could have been double counted. It includes children and so on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good question, like what is behind that statistic? Yeah. But that was the number that the map offered up, so I took it at face value, and maybe I shouldn't have. Wow. But yeah, it's a very high number, mm-hmm. and people are maybe getting evicted multiple times. And that number is only the ones who went to court. Yeah, it's not even the ones who... I think it's 3 years, so 2014,
okay.
15, and
All right.
16. Yeah. So the 3-year average, 54,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. So also I want to just point out, there's a discrepancy in the statistic here because the 1.5 million people is one thing, and the 50,000 is the number of eviction, oh no, they correlate. So there was another set of statistics where it was people versus eviction notices, but eviction notices are often for multiple people. So I think I managed to just get a consistent set of statistics here, but thank you. That's always an important thing to think about. What does this number mean in terms of the sheer number of people being displaced out of their homes? Yeah. Thank you.
All right, well, a true professor who finishes the lecture right on time, including all the questions. So many thanks once again for your very informative and powerful presentation. And well, thanks to all of you for engaging with, well, for being here, attending and participating with your questions, and those online as well. So, oh, another question? No, all right. So that wraps up our distinguished lecture, distinguished researcher lecture for R&I Week this year. So thanks once again, Dr. Jeppesen, and enjoy the next event, which is...
On your way out,
yes?
if you want to stop in and see our business students, they have their posters out to talk to you about what they've been doing in their class.
All right. So
Also food.
Yes, take some food too. I'm going to take it out to the students as well, but before they grab it. But
yeah. All right. Let's
Thanks,
give a
everyone.
final round of applause.